Hello, welcome to our seminar this evening. We have a bunch of people who are going to keep joining, so I'm going to repeat myself a little bit in this little opening section here. But we're going to be recording this tonight, so don't worry if you miss anything or if you want to go back and check anything again. We're going to have this on our Facebook page. We're also going to have it on our website, so you'll have access to it. Tonight we have our session on the Chicago bungalow builders and the American Dream with Patty Swanson. Patty is an historian, educator, and artist living in Chicago. She was raised near Austin, Texas, and came here in 2011 to pursue a degree in art history at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and stayed for the city's rich history, friendly people, and balmy winters. Patty is the creator, chief guide, and organizer of Chicago for Chicagoans. In addition to giving architectural and history tours, Patty is an event planner, brick lover, and multidisciplinary artist interested in the overlap between the city and book arts. Her artwork focuses on community activism, memory, place, genealogy, and the accessibility of the arts. She also works at Bricks Incorporated, which has been around for, over more than 40 years. Patty has a number of absolutely fascinating interests that we thought you guys would all really take to, even down to bricks. We have a lot of some like serious brick lovers for our members. Just so you guys know, we've disabled the chat tonight, but we're gonna have a Q&A section. So as you know, we're going through tonight, I would say, you know, you might want to wait a little while. I know Patty's got a ton of stuff that she wants to cover. She's super passionate about, so I'm like really excited about this evening, but she's, you know, going to cover a bunch, but, you know, as questions come up for you guys, you can put them in the Q&A. I'm going to be going through those as we go through the talk tonight. And at the end, we're going to have about 15 minutes or so to actually take those questions with Patty. So again, for those of you who have just joined us, I'm just watching the number go up. We're recording everything tonight, so don't worry if you miss anything. Patty's going to talk for, I think, around an hour or so, and then, yeah, we'll do questions at the end. So Patty, if you want to get started, if you are good to go, I think we are ready for a share.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Hopefully you can all hear me, but I think we're good. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then I'm going to dive right into it because bungalows are in my blood and Chicago's neighborhoods are what I spend all my time researching. So this is a really exciting topic for me to cover, and I tried to do a really good job for you guys. So let's see. All right, screen share working okay? All right, great. Okay. Here's my contact information. Please feel free to drop me an email. I'll put this up at the end again. If you have any other questions or ones that don't get answered, I'm always happy to talk to you and chat with you about Chicago history. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Carla, as well. So let's dive right into it. To start with the history of Chicago bungalows, you have to really talk about the history of Chicago's neighborhoods, because bungalow neighborhoods and bungalow communities are actually some of the newest neighborhoods that we have. And when I say that, I mean, you know, the neighborhoods that have been around for over 90 years, over 100 years in some cases, the foundational neighborhoods that we really think of when we think of Chicago neighborhoods. I'm not talking about the like marketing strategies around new areas of the South Loop. But bungalows were built pretty late in the game in terms of Chicago neighborhoods. And to talk about them, there's a little bit of a journey we have to take. So we're going to take it back a little bit. Part of the reason I included the American Dream in this presentation is because immigrants are the entire reason we have Chicago. It's also the entire reason we have the unique patchwork quilt of neighborhoods with distinct neighborhood identities. So let's talk a little bit about how immigrants came to the city, the types of housing that they lived in, and we will wrap up with the bungalows, of course. So whenever I start a topic about how Chicago got started, I think it's really important to just acknowledge that there were over 10,000 people living in the northern Mississippi River Valley at the time that Europeans first landed here. So this is by no means empty land that was just discovered by East Coasters. You know, many indigenous people living here for generations and generations. But in the 1820s and 1830s, that really starts to change dramatically. This area had always been a really good place to build a settlement because of some unique geographic features we have. So, let me get on to my first slide here. We are situated on this really important piece of land. There's the Chicago River, which comes out of Lake Michigan, obviously connects to the whole Great Lakes system. And then over a very small continental divide off the South Branch of the Chicago River, we have access to tributaries of the Mississippi River. So by kind of having a settlement here and taking advantage of these waterways, Indigenous people and later Europeans were able to really get around super easily. Water transportation was the name of the game back when your other option was a wagon with like wooden wheels that bumped everywhere. You know, not fun to be on the Oregon Trail. Here's another image of some of those portage routes laid over kind of a modern street grid to give you a sense. There's this big kind of swampy area called Mud Lake, and you would usually pick your canoe up and kind of walk around it. And that portage route was shown to, you know, Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet when they first came through here in the 1600s by Indigenous residents. But as I mentioned, things began to change really in the 1820s and 30s. And the first thing that totally changes this area is the Erie Canal. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, how does the Erie Canal all the way over in New York State affect me here in Chicago? But really, there would be no Chicago without the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal opened in 1925. It was an immediate success. They immediately began expanding it. And look at these maps. The rate of travel to get from New York going from 6 weeks to the Chicago area to as little as 3 weeks. So having the time of travel just through the construction of that canal. Another really important thing that happened, really a sad thing as well, was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which pretty much came about because of the Fort Dearborn affair, I'll say. Basically, the government did a forcible relocation of all the Indigenous people west of the Mississippi River. So many East Coasters, many new immigrants to the country felt more safe building a new city here. It was tough back in the day to be Indigenous, still is. Now, Chicago didn't just take advantage of these water routes it was perfectly situated next to. It also was an early adopter of rail. Our first railroad actually opened the same year as our first canal, 1848, the Galena and Chicago Union. And as you can see from this early railroad map in 1870, Chicago had really quickly built this network that all kind of centered on itself. You know, we were the gateway to the west and we were the gateway to the east. So if you were trying to get agricultural goods to the east, you had to go through Chicago. If you were trying to just get out west, you had to go through Chicago. So there's a really important transportation network here from the very, very beginning. Now, the reason that's important is because most of the country's immigrants came in through eastern ports or western ports. And when all of the railroad lines going anywhere else in the country end up in Chicago, we became a magnet for immigration. Another kind of interesting thing to point out is in 1850, it took you 44 days, more than a month, to cross the Atlantic Ocean. By the time you get to 1875, steamships are around and it takes about 10 days. So all of a sudden it became a much more attractive option to immigrate to the United States. So I will go on to the next slide here. Of course, we know what happens. Despite being this great magnet, not just for immigrants who, seeking a better life or a different life here in the United States, we're also a magnet for anyone just living in a rural community who wanted to, you know, make a little money, move to the big city, find a different job. It was really easy to get here and lots of opportunity here. Of course, in 1871, we all know the Great Chicago Fire happens, burns down a ton of the city. But the important thing to realize, and something I feel like is not talked about enough, is that the Great Chicago Fire didn't really touch most of our agricultural and you know, manufacturing facilities, as well as not really affecting much of our rail lines. So, you know, it left a full third of the city homeless. It burned down tons and tons of residences, but you could build yourself a little shanty, go back to work the next day and start making that money to rebuild. So we did rebuild quite efficiently, quite quickly. And that had a really, really important impact on Chicago because the, you know, it's all colliding here, which is one thing you'll come to realize. It's a lot of factors. Immigration is spiking. People are moving to Chicago. I've got this great little section here showing you just the population data, the raw population data of Chicago in this period I'm talking about. We were 92nd largest city in the country in 1840, only 4,000 people. By the time we make it to 1920, we're the second largest with, over 2 million. So really, really transformative time for Chicago. But the fire's impact really comes down to what happened after it. A number of things happened. The first are the fire limits. So this map here you can see on the right shows you in yellow the fire limits. So immediately was passed an ordinance that is functionally the first example of building code or zoning that we have in Chicago and in many parts of the United States as well. And basically what they said is you can't build with wood downtown anymore. It's too much of a fire risk. If you want to build with wood, you have to go further out. So if you're rebuilding downtown, you have to build with masonry. But, Chicago brick production hadn't really ramped up at that point in time. We didn't really start getting our massive brick industry until after the fire. Surprise, surprise. So, building with masonry was really expensive and just not really accessible to a lot of these immigrants that were pouring into the country. So naturally, they immigrated outside of the central business district as it became to the neighborhoods where they formed communities and enclaves and that I'll continue getting into here. But, that first move of just saying you could only build this style of building in this area, the impact cannot be overstated. Businesses, people with more money, businesses with insurance were the ones that rebuilt downtown, and it naturally sort of formed this business district neighborhood relationship that we still have today. The other thing that's really, not there yet, sorry. The other thing that's really impactful at this time is the influx of people. You would think that the city would maybe shrink if it all burned down. Obviously, as you can see by these statistics, that was not quite the case. And there's a number of reasons for that. A lot of people were wooed by the building boom. You have a lot of great young architects looking for work moving here. Louis Sullivan moves here in 1873, John Welborn Root, 1871, Hollibird of Hollibird and Roche, 1875. So a lot of architects fresh out of school looking for work knew they could find architecture work here when the whole city was wiped out. You also had a huge influx again of laborers and immigrants who knew that there would be a lot of work rebuilding the city for them. Construction work, things that they could do with little to no skills or even little to no grasp of English. So really, really huge magnet again for the city. I'm going to read you one quote here, which is this is from the Real Estate and Building Journal of 1881. Where there had not been a single house in 1880, there were 1,000 houses and a population of 5,000 just 2 years later, 1882. Within 40 years, the city's population grew from under 30,000 to over 1 million. And by the close of the 19th century, Chicago was the 5th largest city in the world. I'm going to let that sink in. 5th largest city from being, a frontier town with 200 people in 1833. Really, really big change. So that brings me to the next thing I really want to talk about, which are these different immigrant groups. Because when you're talking about Chicago neighborhoods, there's a million different kinds of Chicago neighborhood, and they all sort of form their unique identity based on the people that were the first ones to move out of those fire limits and start these communities. So I want to briefly kind of run through some of the major immigrant groups here from about 1830 to 1930. I'm starting, of course, with two of the biggest, the Germans and the Irish. For about 50 years, people of German descent constituted the largest ethnic group in the entire city. By 1900, 500,000 Chicagoans, or 25% of the city, 1 out of 4, had either been born in Germany themselves or their parents had been born in Germany. Germans moving to Chicago around this time were a really interesting subset of the German population. There's actually a failed political revolution in 1848. They were called the 48ers, and they immigrated here in mass to basically protest them not liking the politics of their home country anymore. Most of them were pretty well-educated, middle-class liberals, a lot of skilled workers, a lot of entrepreneurs, many of them middle class. They had some money, and they were just like, I hate the politics of this country so bad, I'm moving. I'm moving across the ocean. It's going to take me 10 days, and I don't care. We're at the time 44 days. The next group that we really important to talk about are the Irish, and they came from very, very different conditions. Obviously, everyone knows the great Irish potato famine. It's actually 5 failures of the potato crops. 5 consecutive years of failing potato crops, beginning in 1845. Ireland lost 1.5 million people to immigration, and they were mostly poor laborers. They had nothing. They'd been driven destitute by the potato crop failures. The only advantage they had over pretty much every other immigrant coming here at the same time were that they spoke English. And that's actually how Irish became a really important political force in the city, because they had to step up from the very beginning. They were treated lower than the low, but if you have English, it's just so much easier to function in the country then and the country now. Woo, man, I'm skipping all over. Okay, here we go. Next one. Next groups I want to talk about are the Czech or Bohemians. We were the 3rd largest Czech city in the world by 1900. The Czechs were a really interesting subset of people. A lot of working class socialists, radical free thinkers, coupled with the Germans who were a lot of anarchists. It was a really fun mix of people. The Czechs and Bohemians really paved the way for a lot more Eastern immigration that followed, as well as the Scandinavians, particularly the Swedes. We gained 1 million Swedes moving here from 1845 to 1930, largely due to overpopulation in Sweden, relatively late industrialization of the country. And they moved here because they wanted to have land and start new businesses. And many of them were skilled tradesmen, entrepreneurs. A kind of staggering fact is that by 1910, 1/5 of all people born in Sweden lived in the United States, as well as, of course, their neighbors, Finnish and Norwegians, immigrating around the same time for about the same reasons. Talking about paving the way for Eastern European immigrants, thanks to the Czech and the Bohemians, you had the Polish coming in next. There were actually quite a few different waves of Polish immigration. The first started in about 1850, mostly Catholic peasants, really, really destitute people seeking a better life. Chicago had the largest ethnically Polish population outside of Warsaw by 1918. Crazy, crazy, crazy numbers of people leaving their countries to come here. As well as, this is a really fun and crazy fact of United States history, but Russians, and I put Russians in quotes because a lot of the census takers and people that recorded immigration data called anyone who was Jewish Russian in paperwork. I don't know if it was just a misunderstanding of hearing Jewish languages, if there was just a large amount of Russian Jews that were immigrating and they just extrapolated. But basically, we can't look at historical records and understand who is just Russian and not Jewish, who was Jewish from Russia, and who was just Jewish from every other part of the world. So Russians, really Jewish people, mostly arriving in the 1800s to, surprise, surprise, avoid persecution in their home countries. They were a lot of really, they had a really tough life, but they were really good entrepreneurs. Many of them started at the lowest level. They were like street vendors, and worked their ways up to pretty decent, running pretty nice businesses. Next up, we have 3 more groups that are important to talk about. The Greeks. Greeks are a really fascinating immigrant group in Chicago history because they had the largest repatriation rates. Started coming here about the 1840s, mostly to avoid extreme poverty or being drafted into the Turkish army. Not a very popular, fun thing to do. And they mostly came just to earn enough money to pay off family debts, to pay for dowries for their sisters or their daughters. And then many of them went right back to Greece. Many of them stayed as well. A lot of merchants, a lot of business people. Italians start coming in 1880. Our population of Italians peaks in about 1930. At that point, it was the 3rd largest Italian population in the entire country. Chicago was. Mostly laborers, but Italians were really good at kind of working their way up in the construction industry. Many of them became tradespeople that still exist to this day, and are kind of became what we would call today like blue collar citizens. And lastly, also at this time, and I think often neglected in these conversations, Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants started coming to the country in the mid-1800s looking for mostly employment building railroads, really brutal low-wage labor opportunities. It's what they were coming for, as well as mining in California and agriculture. But as that railroad work dried up, as the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, many of them hopped on those rails they built and just moved further and further east. one of the rare groups that immigrated to the country from the West Coast. It became very, very unpopular and difficult and painful to be Chinese in California. So you could, face a little less persecution if you move further east, and Chicago was one of the first stops off the train. Unfortunately, that dried up very quickly. In 1882, the government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which actually forbade the men that had come here from leaving the country and returning. So if you went home to visit your family, you couldn't come back to the US. And you absolutely were not allowed to bring anyone else with you. So it actually led to whole generations of just young men without wives, without families, who had just been forced to abandon their families in China. Really, really, probably the worst of all the people that were treated like shit, honestly. Ooh, pardon my language. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the kind of work that these, I keep skipping, I'm sorry. Let's talk a little bit about the kinds of work that these immigrants did. When I was first approached by my lovely colleagues at the Chicago Bungalow Association to kind of talk about this topic, there's a lot of conversation about, well, we want to talk about the laborers, the people who built these bungalows, but the story of immigrants and the story of laborers in Chicago is the same story. So it's really important to realize that the people that were forming early trade unions and were going on mass strikes and were protesting horrible working conditions were immigrants. So it's all the same story. I actually recently did a really deep dive into the history of labor and the history of unions in Chicago that is available to watch a recording of for free on chicagoforchicagoans.org. So as much as I would so love to dive deep into labor history, I cannot keep you all here for 10 hours. So go watch that recording if you're really interested in it, and I'll kind of hit the highlights right now. The highlights are that it was the worst possible working conditions you could think of, rampant discrimination against every immigrant group at one point or another, language barriers, tons of poverty, a lot of fights in between immigrant groups. It's just like people who are really poor and desperate fighting against other people who are poor and desperate because the scraps they're given are so meager. And a lot of them would band together with other people like them to form support networks and communities. And that's another reason that those neighborhoods start organically forming, because when you can't shop at certain stores in the city, you just go to the stores run by other Polish immigrants. So, you don't have a problem accessing those stores, or you don't have a problem getting social services or having your Polish child be taken into the public school. Those neighborhoods formed really important support networks of resources that you could access despite where you came from. Another really kind of great example of the kind of horrible, horrible work you would be doing as an immigrant in Chicago at the turn of the 19th century. I have this image here of the canal diggers, the I&M Canal, Illinois-Michigan Canal. That was the canal that first opened, 1848. Big canal fan over here. It took 12 years to dig the I&M Canal, mostly due to a lot of different labor strikes and lack of funding. It was backbreaking, brutal low-wage work done almost entirely by Irish immigrants. There was no dynamite at this point in time. You had some black powder if you were lucky, and you dug that entire 96-mile canal by yourself with your hands. Seasonal work, you could only do it in the summer, and they were typically paid $1 for a 16-hour day. That's about $28 today. But you weren't even paid in money. You were paid in proprietary canal script, which was accepted pretty much at the stores along the canal, which would charge you a crazy high markup to accept the canal script. And you could buy land with it. That was it. So really, really brutal. The Industrial Revolution in general was just the worst time to be a worker. I mean, it was really hard. People were really interested in creating more efficient systems and maximizing profits. And one of the strategies that came about, and that really is the foundation of the Industrial Revolution, was dividing labor. So as an example, like instead of paying a master butcher $30 an hour to butcher one cow perfectly at a time, you did the slaughterhouse method, where you would, teach a bunch of unskilled laborers, in this case, mostly immigrants. You teach each of them one part of the process, and they do that one part of the process all day long, and you could pay them 20 cents a day. The disassembly line was invented in Chicago. Henry Ford got the idea for the assembly line by visiting the slaughterhouses in Chicago. So really, really efficient way to make a lot of money. Really, really great way to abuse your workers as well. Lots of strikes, lots of dissatisfaction with your life. It was a really rough transition for a lot of these immigrants because in their home countries, they've been entrepreneurs, they've been small business people, they've been, in charge of their own work and the product of their own work. And all of a sudden, they're forced into this system where they're doing this menial task for 12 to 16 hours a day, and they're not in control of the fruits of their labor. It was a really, really tough transition for many of these immigrants. There's all kinds of waves of strikes and protests, and it's fascinating history if you want to go check out my other lecture on it. Really, really brutal time to be alive. I love this image of Chicago streets as well. This is basically the northeast corner of where the Daily Center is today. That building right in the front is the McDonald's. Anyway, crazy, crazy, crazy thing of Chicago looking like this, but this is really common. So Chicago, major manufacturing center. Here we go. Working conditions, not good. Lots of strikes. That's all I can say about this right now because I do not have enough time. Wonderful. So where do you live? If you have no money, if your working life is really difficult, where do you live? Again, you're not going to live downtown. You can't afford to build with masonry. So you head into the outlying neighborhoods where you can build with wood. You had room to grow. You had a room to create a self-sustaining community of immigrants and other people like you. You had the opportunity to build those neighborhoods close to where you were already working. And you could build things like churches and fraternal groups, schools, restaurants, shops, all kinds of things serving all the needs of your community. The poorest of the immigrants tended to live in the worst areas, surprise, surprise. I'll read you a little fun quote. Generally, these neighborhoods were swampy, sooty, stinky, and close to industrial warehouses, producing belches of toxic fumes. Steel workers settle between Ashland, Archer, and 35th. They call it Mount Pleasant. The name was probably ironic because of the adjacent steel mills and because much of the area was swampy and undrained. Standing water bred hordes of mosquitoes, and spring flooding was so severe that many houses were built on stilts. You got the worst land if you had the least money, but you could at least buy some land with your proprietary canal script. And this is where I'm going to start getting into some specific examples from the Chicago neighborhood history that I've studied. A lot of groups, especially in my first example, Bohemians, just created these really dense immigrant-friendly spaces and formed somewhat insular communities. And as they're building these communities, again, there's not a lot of money and the houses are built very eclectic. It's not a planned, organized community. It's not when you think of your row of Chicago bungalows, it is so far from that at this point. So I want to talk about a couple different things here. Here's some more great maps. I love maps. You can see the annexation patterns of Chicago, which also help form our neighborhoods. All the places where you could build with wood eventually got annexed to the city in 1889, actually. So let's talk a little bit about some of those early neighborhoods. And to do that, I want to talk a little bit about Pilsen. Okay, so we're going to start with what is known as the workers' cottage. I love all these images of Pilsen. I included them because it's a great example of this functional eclecticism that I'm talking about, where you'd build your neighborhoods really patchwork. You'd have this beautiful St. Adalbert's cathedral right next to, just all kinds of little tiny homes, particularly workers' cottages. So the workers' cottages were built pretty quick after the fire. It was a narrow, rectangular 4 to 6 room building, usually only 2 rooms wide, about 1.5 stories. Raised basement, so you could stay out of the swamp. Tend to be built with wood frame at first, and then brick as you got a little bit more money. Again, those Chicago brickyards ramping up starting about 1872. And generally the brick workers' cottages are a little bit smaller. The wood frame ones are a little bit bigger. This brick's expensive, or was then. Anyway, I love this ad. This is This is an ad from 1883, just kind of showing you the layout. There were no bathrooms in your traditional workers' cottage. You were using an outhouse out back. They often cost as little as $2,000 to build. And most of them use like standardized house plans. So you'll see a lot of the kind of same exact workers' cottage. This ad you'll also notice is in German. And I want you to pay attention to that name, S.E. Gross. We're going to talk a lot about Samuel Gross. But this is a great ad. It really kind of shows you what your housing was like long before the bungalow, but after the fire. Yeah, I love this. Vestibule, parlor, 2 bedrooms, 2 closets, kitchen, pantry, no bathroom. So as residents grew in prosperity, new architecture was built to reflect that. So what's really common in neighborhoods like Pilsen, you'll even see it on the north side in areas like Lincoln Square and Roscoe Village, you would build the cheapest, simplest house on the back of the lot. And then as you made a little bit more money, you would build a nicer home on the front of the lot. Maybe you'd build a 2-flat or a 3-flat. And being able to build that 2 residences, potentially one with even more rentable space in it on the same lot, was a great way to maximize the value of your land. And landlording was a way that you could make money outside of your horrible job. And you could also create a softer landing pad for other immigrants like you. So I want to read you this really great story it's actually from the Pilsen National Historic District Register nomination. Fascinating read. Emma Rouse-King, she was a German immigrant. She grew up on South Damon Avenue in Pilsen, described the apartment building she grew up in. And I'm reading this whole quote because it's amazing. It was on a corner with a big bay window above, 2 storerooms, which were occupied by a clothier. On the rear of the property was a 2-story brick house with 2 apartments. Beneath this house was a stable for driving horses. Between the 2 buildings, in the basement, was a carpenter shop covered with a tarred and gravelled roof. This roof was used for clotheslines for the smaller house and for the tenants of the entire 10 apartments, where they also did their carpet beating along these lines. The sidewalk around the buildings was made of 16-foot wooden planks, and a short staircase led down to the laundry and to the fuel bins. Both sides of the building were just alike. So on one plot of land, an apartment building, a small house, a carpenter shop, 2 retail stores, and 10 apartments. Bonkers. But that was a really efficient way to make your money. Fascinating. So you're building all this land. You build your tiny little workers' cottage with the money you scavenged together from your horrible industrial job. And you want to build that nicer 3-flat on the front of the lot. How do you fund it? You're not going to get a loan. Hell if the bank's giving you a loan in this day and age as an immigrant, especially as an immigrant who didn't speak English. There's a couple different ways you could fund these properties. The first is the building savings and loan. These were first started by Bohemians. They basically built all of Pilsen through building, saving, and loans organizations. What they would do is immigrants would join. They would deposit all of their life savings into the community account, and a council of elders, shall we say, would decide who gets a loan for things like building and home ownership and all of that. So it was immigrant run, immigrant funded. It was really, really successful. By 1912, there were 106 building and loan societies accounting for over $10 million in assets. 600 buildings were built in Pilsen between 1874 and 1883, all subsidized by these organizations. They had no regular offices. They actually met in community centers called Sokol, S-O-K-O-L. So there's 2 images here on the slide of different buildings. The one on the left still exists. It's right there on 18th Street. And these were just like community halls, general purpose community halls, and the Building Savings and Loan Organization would meet there, let's say on Sundays, and decide, take money, give out loans, etc. And again, really, really great way, landlording, to sort of raise your status in the world, get closer to that American dream. The neighborhood was built super independently. Many Bohemians became landlords, although the building savings and loan organizations didn't last forever. A lot of them failed in the Great Depression. They weren't insured. And many second generation immigrants were like, no, mom, dad, I'm putting my money in the bank. I'm not giving it to a bunch of old weird guys that meet at the community hall every Sunday. Another way you could fund new construction were familial and fraternal organizations. Chinatown's a great example of this. You had family societies, you had tongs, you had merchant and benevolent associations, and those community organizations and familial associations are pretty much the entire reason we have Chinatown. They also provided things like social services, arbitration, protection, aid, and they often ran illegal gambling halls because, you know, when you literally can't get a job anywhere and you're trying to survive, illegal activities are a great way to fund the benevolent actions of your organization. So it's really important to contextualize desperation and the things we do to fund good things for our people. Another great way, obviously, religious groups, Polish and Irish immigrants being a great example of this. They were cornerstones to community development in Chicago, creating some of the city's first charities, first hospitals, first orphanages. They created daycare, cemeteries, social service organizations. They addressed juvenile delinquency. I mean, religious organizations did a lot. Many immigrants were religious. On the opposite side, you have secular clubs, bowling. Every freaking immigrant group on the north side had like 12 bowling leagues. I'm not even kidding. Andersonville, Edgewater, just full of bowling everywhere. It's even built into the architecture if you know what to look for. Bowling, sport, singing clubs, temperance organizations, educational organizations, trade unions. Really important thing, Lind Hardware, which is actually the building up in Andersonville is now home to the Swedish American Museum. That was actually, it hosted a building exchange. So it was a hardware store, but an early hardware store started by immigrants, but it also kind of hosted these meetups of tradesmen. So you would go to the store run by the Swedish guy you knew to buy your tools, and you'd meet other tradesmen and talk about your industry. So another, you know, really great meeting place and place where you could find funding and find support for your dreams. But of course, the most important source of funding for a lot of Chicago history is bars. Bars, bars, bars. Chicago's bars at one point were feeding more people through their free lunch with a pint of beer program than all of Chicago's charities combined. Two great examples here, Simon's Tavern, also in Andersonville. They would cash paychecks free of charge. You know, the business owner, he would have, Simon, he had a bank account, but you as an immigrant maybe had a lot of trouble getting a bank account, so he'd cash your check for you. And fun fact, if you cash your check at the bar, the likelihood of you buying a beer right afterwards with your earnings, very high. He was notorious for having ample free food for all of his bar patrons, again, just feeding the masses. And Simon was notoriously generous. He would help any Swede down on his luck. He would, you know, give out loans. The craziest thing to me is at one point, Simon's, the small bar in Andersonville, was cashing $14,000 per week in checks. That's the equivalent of $200,000 per week in check cashing alone. Skylark and Pilsen, serving Czech, Irish, German, and Polish working class, also cashed checks well into the 1970s. I also threw Walter's Tavern on here, really, really early example of an integrated bar in Chicago on the south side, run by Polish immigrants. Now, let's talk about developers. We've talked about immigrants. We've talked about where immigrants worked. We've talked about how immigrants made money, how they funded new construction, how they built things to live in. But the other really important piece of the puzzle are real estate developers. It's still how things get built, and it was certainly how things were built back then. They did a huge amount of building rail lines in Chicago. A lot of the rail networks we owe to some degree to real estate developers because they would pay for the line to be extended to the neighborhood they wanted to create because they knew by bringing that transit out, people would want to move there. They also would just see where a new rail line was built and then buy up all the land and profit off of it. You know, but developers and railroads very closely aligned. Neighborhoods became very attractive, and the farther out the neighborhood was, the more attractive it became to some degree because these inner neighborhoods, the ones on the very edge of those fire limits, started to get really, really crowded, really, really terribly crowded conditions. So people like Samuel Gross, pictured here, would, they'd I mean, he's the reason we mostly have Roscoe Village. He's part of the reason we have Edgewater. He did hundreds and hundreds of developments all throughout the city. And, you know, he would market his advertisements in the way that you see here. He'd say, good and cheap lots. Price is only $400 to $650. Go and see them. Take the streetcar outside of the fire limits. You can build wooden houses. No city taxes. These ads just give me so much life. I love them. You can see this one is Roscoe Village development pictured in the ad. Samuel Gross, like many real estate developers of this time, did not start out as a real estate developer. He started out as a lawyer. After enough financial panics, he got into real estate development. 1891, as you can see from this fun little chart I found, it's a peak year in Chicago's land values. Getting into real estate development was a good idea then, and it's still kind of a good idea. But Samuel Gross was a little bit different. He specifically targeted blue collar folks and immigrants. He published catalogs and ads like this. He offered homeowners a choice of 400 floor plans you could buy from. And he, like many of his contemporaries, would offer small down payments. You could put, you know, a small percentage down and then slowly pay off the rest over time. The modern day mortgage, but that, you know, was novel at the time. Gross has often been called the most prolific home builder in Chicago history. He sold at one point 500 lots a week, transported 3,000 people daily, and as many as 27 different rail cars to inspect his properties. Crazy, crazy, crazy guy. And again, all the things that made him successful were just catering to immigrants, recognizing their needs, and inputting a high standard of living in his fringe neighborhoods. You know, he would put in indoor plumbing. He would mass produce various parts of the home so he could provide it to immigrants for really cheap, and really, really successful. Another guy I wanted to throw a mention to, John Lewis Cochran, pretty much is the whole reason we have the neighborhood of Edgewater. He capitalized off the train extension. He and Mr. Gross, as you can see, worked together to some degree. He was a former tobacco salesman, and he was from Pennsylvania, and named pretty much every street in Edgewater after train stations outside of Philadelphia. Fun fact. All right. So this brings me into housing styles. I'm getting closer and closer to talking about bungalows, I promise. I would like to do a special shout out to my friend Phil Thompson at Wonder City Studio, who always lets me use his illustrations for historical talks. Check him out. He used to go by Cape Horn Illustration, and he illustrates Chicago housing styles, which is really helpful as a visual aid. So the first wave of construction in some of these, you know, further and further out neighborhoods, as we get beyond that functional eclecticism of neighborhoods like Pilsen and Roscoe Village, as we start to get into more planned neighborhoods, we see a lot of these going up. And this is really the first wave. You get 2 flats, you get 3 flats. You know, the 2 flat is a vertical duplex. Really handy. You can live on the property, rent out the other unit, and functionally your mortgage is paid for. 3 flats, same sort of thing. Landlords and builders would take this nicest unit for themselves and then, you know, rent out the other ones to newcomers of the same or allied heritage. 2-part commercial block, another really important housing style you can see all over the city. You have your store on the first floor, you live above it. Tale as old as time. Here we go. A little bit, another option, similar, same vein, the Greystone. Greystones are functionally just 2 flats built with nicer stone. They tended to be lining the boulevards across from parks. Like, you're not rich enough to have your own single family home, but you're rich enough to make your 2 flat like a little nicer, you know, put it across from a park. Row homes, those go up as well, mostly developer driven. A developer would build a whole row of homes, but they never really caught on in Chicago in the way they did in other East Coast cities because there's a lot of restrictions about fire in this city, believe it or not, crazy. Basically, you have to put a big, thick fireproof wall in between each one of the row homes, and it's just not cost efficient. So they were never really quite as popular in Chicago as in other cities. Now, the problem is, as we approach the turn of the century, as we reach 1900, many of those early lots sold by people like Samuel Gross for, 450 down, take the streetcar out, see the lot. They built pretty small single family homes on, and by the 1900, those lots were sold. And what started to happen is the need for housing only grew. Immigrants only continued to pour into the city. More and more people moved to Chicago, and the need for housing didn't change, but the available land did. So what you start seeing by 1900 is they would tear down single family homes, things like workers' cottages. They would tear down the workers' cottage and they would put up higher density housing. They would put up 2 flats, they'd put up 3 flats. And then, as we're going to see very shortly here, they would build even higher density because the need for housing only continued to grow. So let's talk about 1902 and the girl, Jane Addams. 1902, Chicago passes the Tenement House Ordinance, directly tracing its roots to Jane Addams and her contemporaries, who, mostly women, who would band together and go inspect tenements. They went to the near northwest side where there were a lot of Polish. They went to the overcrowded Jewish enclaves on the near west side, as well as the lower west neighborhoods like Pilsen, where the Czechs lived. The neighborhoods a little bit closer into the city that became very overpopulated, reason people were being driven out. And they published a report in 1901 that said, housing's deplorable, we have to do something about it. And that led to the Tenement House Ordinance, which passed in 1902. And functionally what it did was it made suggestions that you build slightly nicer places. And this is when you start seeing things like the courtyard apartment building. I live in a courtyard apartment building. I love them. They're amazing. And they're all because of the 1902 housing ordinance. They allowed greater density. Obviously, you can put a lot more families into a courtyard apartment building. Developers would build them often on corner lots. They could buy 1 or 2 properties, knock them down, and put up this really, really big moneymaker on the corner. They allowed greater density, but they also allowed people a window in every room, thanks to the 1902 ordinance. They had provisions for air. You could get lovely cross breezes in courtyard apartment buildings. They had this little green space in the courtyard, and usually a back stair attached to the kitchen, allowing better fire egress. So absolutely transformational for the lives of people living, really tough immigrant lives of the early 1900s. This represented a massive improvement. Developers liked these too. They really weren't mad about those ordinances so much because they allowed them to build pretty dense. I mean, 4 stories high, about as far as they could build before people would, complain about doing all the stairs. There you go. 6 flats, you could put those a little bit further in on the street where maybe you could only get 1 big lot instead of 2, You see a lot more courtyard apartment buildings on corners. You see a lot of 6 flats further in on the street. Same principle. Okay, the last one I was going to talk about, but I forgot to put a slide in, was apartment hotels. Apartment hotels were also really popular. If you've ever been to Edgewater, there's all kinds of really tall buildings from like the 1920s. They featured hotel-like amenities, and they became really popular with 2 very different groups of people. They became very popular with immigrant families fresh off the boat who were like, I need somewhere to stay that's cheaper than a hotel, but I haven't found a more permanent residence yet. And they'd cram, 6 people into this really tiny room with just barely a kitchenette. And they also became very popular with the emerging, flapper generation. We're getting into the 20s now. This is when women are starting to have some more independence. You have more young professionals commuting into the city on the train lines, and they like the apartment hotels too. There's tons of them in Edgewater, and especially South Shore, all along the lake, you see a lot of them. Even higher density, lots more stories. Came seedier later on, got a bad rap. Okay, so this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about my neighborhood. I live in Albany Park, because Albany Park's like the perfect case study for how people moved throughout the city over time. So I put together this timeline a couple of years ago, just kind of showing the neighborhood transition between different immigrant groups. These photos here, the first one is right after the Kimball, the one on the right is the one right when Kimball Brown Line opened. It blows my mind to look at this image. And absolutely bonkers to think about. 1908, when the Kimball Brown line opened, this is what was around it. A few years later, you get that image on the left. You have these 6 flats, these 3 flats, these 4 flats, all throughout being built just around dirt roads and unpaved sidewalks. But the pattern that we see in Albany Park and in many other places is that once an immigrant family gets a foothold in the country and they're making a little money through small business ownership or through being a landlord or moving up in the job world because a new, more disliked immigrant group has taken your place at the bottom rung of the ladder. They wanted to get out of those crowded neighborhoods and those horrible conditions, and they moved to these more fringe neighborhoods. And there's all kinds of movement patterns that are really common. You move from an apartment hotel to a courtyard apartment. You move from a 6 flat to something lower density, like a 2 flat or a 3 flat. You move from an overcrowded neighborhood to a new, nice neighborhood. Albany Park got a huge wave of Jewish people from the west side moving there when it opened because they were like, breathing room, finally. You move from the residents above your shop to a single family home. You don't have to live over your shop anymore. And, your family starts to grow generational wealth. Now you have the second generation and they've had more access to things than the first people that came here. They speak English. They don't want to put their money in the building and savings associations. They're American citizens. And you just start to work your way up in the world. So Albany Park, again, started by a developer, 1893. They buy a huge plot of land, bring the train out here. It opens in 1908. And the early builders in the neighborhood, German, Swedish, Czech, those early builders were looking for like single family homes, more green space. And then you see the higher density housing start to come into the neighborhood. Again, Jewish folks moving up into the greener pastures of Albany Park. Lots of 2-part commercial block, and pretty much every housing style I'm talking about today can be found in Albany Park. It's fascinating. Here you go. Here's some more crazy images of Albany Park throughout the ages. Out there, just a very brief mention to Mr. William Harmon, another real estate developer, much like Samuel Gross. He's the one who started Ravenswood Manor. Some really great images here. And he was, again, one of those pioneers that pioneered the, $10 down or $100 down, $10 a month after that. And you can live in a model home, a beautiful thing. And Ravenswood Manor is a good example of one of those early neighborhoods focused on the construction of single-family homes. And single-family homes are, of course, inching our way to the bungalow. A lot of these images I actually pulled, the whole top row here, come from Ravenswood Manor. Ravenswood Manor, if you're not familiar, it's basically just at the North Branch of the river and Lawrence Avenue. Great little historic neighborhood. And William Harmon was like, hey, come on out, take the train, come see it, come see a lot, come buy a house. You can buy a house plan, come buy one of them, come build one of them. A lot of times these developers would work hand in hand with architects. So, they'd have one architect build a whole row of bungalows or a whole row of 2 flats. Or the opposite case is that you have somebody come out and buy one of those lots from someone like William Harmon and then hire their own architects to build a really, really unique little house. And there's this great relationship between developers working with architects or individual homeowners building it themselves or individual homeowners working with architects or individual homeowners buying a stock bungalow plan. Oh my goodness, you guys have no idea how much shade you would have gotten if you were an architect who was revealed to be selling stock bungalow house plans. Like, how dare you? You don't care about the architectural integrity and the diverse architectural beauty of our city. You're just building copycat house after copycat house. People didn't like that. They still don't like that to some degree. The last thing I'll say about Ravenswood Manor is that William Harmon marketed it as the first suburb beautiful of the new Chicago. And he was so right in that, because Chicago's Bungalow Belt, thank you, Chicago Bungalow Association, for this image. I stole off your website. Chicago's Bungalow Belt is the fringe edge of Cook County. When you get past the bungalows, you end up in the suburbs. William Harmon wasn't lying. Bungalow neighborhoods represented the first suburbs. It was a house you could have with your family. It was a house you could have with a yard. It would be a single family home. You're not in this crowded courtyard apartment building. You're not in this stuffy tenement. You're not in a 3-flat where you have to be a landlord. Like, finally, you have achieved the American dream. You have bought yourself a bungalow. It was the newest housing. It was the latest housing. They were built to last. They were built with good quality materials. They had nice yards. You were still close to the train. I mean, the bungalow was the epitome of what all of these hardworking immigrants had been working towards for generations. So I have a connection to bungalows. I mentioned this at the very beginning. 4942 North Keystone, you can go see it. It's in Albany Park. Was the residence of my great-grandparents. They bought it in 1915. It was the first home they owned as a young couple. I have a little screenshot of the 1930 census. Swanson, Carl Oscar Swanson, his wife Lillian, and my grandfather Carl, as well as his brother Lester. So they lived in this bungalow. There's some great images I've included here of my great-grandfather in the backyard, and my grandfather on the front porch of that exact same bungalow with his aunt, who would be my great-great-aunt. I love this. I love this family connection. Sadly, this isn't quite the end of the story, because my great-grandparents lost their bungalow in the Great Depression. I mean, they had achieved it. They had made it by 1915, but by 1930, the Depression had really taken hold. And a few years later, the bank foreclosed on their house and they moved back into apartments. It was like taking a step back. And by no means were my great-grandparents the only ones who lost their bungalow. The Depression, I can't stress enough, ripped the American dream from these people who had finally secured that glorious single-family home. And now you're going back to the apartment building. And my great-grandparents bounced around to about 5 or 6 different apartments before my grandfather graduated high school. It's an infamous family story. People were really upset. I'm going to return back to this image here, because obviously World War II pulled the country out of the Great Depression. And after World War II, GIs came back. All of a sudden, they could get a college degree for free. They had money. They'd just been, paid, and they desperately wanted that quaint suburban life. So they built suburbs. And when I say GIs and when I say they built suburbs, I mean white people who had the financial ability and had the GI Bill and had a number of other economic and social opportunities, moved to the suburbs and built themselves little suburban paradises of the exact same home on every single street, just like the bungalows before them. People criticized them for being the exact same house repeated too much. But that's what bungalows were too. They were the first suburb beautiful of the new Chicago. There's silver linings to that flight, to that move to the suburbs as well. It empowered a whole new generation of immigrants and migrants to become homeowners. You have a lot of Black folks moving here to Chicago in the Great Migration. By the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, those Black folks are looking to buy single-family homes of their own. They're looking to get out of crowded public housing and crowded Black neighborhoods as they've been established for decades, and all those white folks fleeing to the suburbs opened up these high quality, lovely residences with yards, opened up all those bungalows for Black folks to live in. And not just Black folks, all kinds of new immigrants that we start seeing coming in from all parts of Asia and South America and Middle East. That immigration is still happening to this day. So that's kind of all that I have to say, but I just punched you guys in the face with a lot of information. I'm proud of myself for wrapping up at 7:29. I did my best. I'm so happy to answer questions. I have so many pages of notes I barely even glossed over.
Patty, that was amazing. Seriously, I learned so much with that I was like, I've seen so many presentations and I've read so much about these things and I still learned so many new things. Yeah, and interesting, about your grandparents losing their home in the Great Depression. That was also when like the bungalow build cutoff is like 19, like rarely you'll find one in like 1933 or 4, because of the Great Depression. So it's an easy way, I mean, all building,
Right.
obviously,
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
for a while there, but yeah, that
You
was
find
really fascinating.
most neighborhoods in Chicago, their construction period ends by 1933.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But yeah, and Phil from Cape Horn, Wonder City, we've done work with too, and seeing that picture of Simon's is like my watering hole. So I was like, looking at it, I was like, is that Simon's?
You know, if you go to Simon's to this day and you talk to the bartenders, they will show you all kinds of relics. They've barely remodeled since 1930, and there's countless relics of that time. There's actually a trapdoor in the stairs that leads up to the apartment above, because they cashed so much money inside the bar that they would pass money through the trapdoor up to the wife, who would take it for safekeeping upstairs in the apartment. I mean, and all that's still there.
Yeah,
Go to Simon's, it's a great little relic.
yeah, it's amazing. And Scotty is amazing there too. So you answered, so we only have a couple of questions up right now. Because you were so thorough, like you covered so much stuff. I was like, whoa. So you did, it was funny, this question came up about how the Great Migration fits into all of this, right? And like a second later, you're like, the Great Migration. So I think we've answered that. Sarah, who posted it, do you feel like we answered that enough of what you were asking? Feel free to type in the Q&A if there was more that you wanted to hear about that, because we do have a little extra time now. And if you want to take this, you can. I can also take it, Patty. But Mike asked how we would define the primary architectural features of the bungalow.
Yeah, I'm going to flip back to my slide here. Of course, the Bungalow Association is the expert on such things, but there's a couple features that are generally pointed to by the Bungalow Association. I define bungalows for people all the time, and I always say the Chicago Bungalow Association, so it's funny to be here. They're about 1.5 stories tall. Traditionally, the basements were unfinished, the attic was unfinished, but there was kind of this idea that you could turn it into a loft space, another bedroom. They always have this little rise, like 4.5 feet up. And that's actually common in all Chicago architecture. And to some degree, I don't know exactly why or how, but there's a lot of reasons why this is the case, that little 4.5 foot up, because it allowed people building those courtyard apartment buildings to actually classify the first floor unit as not a basement. The garden apartment is just marketing. So it allowed that first floor apartment to get a little bit more air, and it allowed you to stretch your 4 foot or your 4-story height restriction, because they're not really 4 stories, it's like 4.5 stories. You had little rises in houses common all the way back to the workers' cottages to keep them out of the swamp and the skunk and the muck. Bungalows have it too. Why do bungalows have it too? To give them a deeper basement? Or is it just because that's how we always did it in Chicago? I find that fascinating. There's some other clues I'll let you.
Yeah, so yeah, 1.5 stories typically. They usually have a hipped roof too, which is where it's like a pyramidal roof, kind of a point in the center, and then 4 planes. There's all different kinds of bays, and also like you can look at them and you'll notice, some of them people love those polygonal bays. Those were late 20s bungalows. Things got really fancy in the late 20s before everything crashed, of course. Yellow brick was also late 20s. Then you had like on the bottom left, that was probably from the somewhere in the 1910s, maybe late 1910s. If you had an open front porch, then that's pretty much definitely 1910s. You had those the pilasters on other sides, or like get the flared. Sometimes there was a flare to them. Some of them, as you guys have probably noticed, have terracotta shingles. Some, many do not, never did. What am I missing here? A lot of stained glass in many of them as well. Dormers were very, very typical, sort of popping out of the center of them and stuff. Some of them, though, you'll find them too with gables. You do see that a lot, and it's very common, a frame gable even. We learned recently, you'll also see them with a Dutch, and I have to like pantomime all this, I always feel like an idiot. These Dutch gambrel gables, which are like me, like there's, they, and you'll see it's like almost a full second story on top of bungalows. And we actually just found an article recently, somebody sent me, how that was a function of soldiers coming home from World War II. And they built them, and you wouldn't know it because usually because you see a lot of shed dormers, like, not very, they're just like, they very much look like this is an addition, they're wood, they don't go with the rest of the home. But these seamless brick gables, they really just blend, they're perfect. They must have just had a lot of that brick still, because matching brick now, as many of you guys may know too, is really not that fun, because there's, as much as bungalows were mass produced and they look so similar, and there's criticism about that. Like if you're a dork like me who's been spent an incalculable number of hours looking at these and on these streets and surveying them, like they are all different. Like there's little, the brickwork is different, the limestone pattern.
Right. I think that's why I really had to bring developers into this story, because there's streets of bungalows where every bungalow looks the same. And then there's neighborhoods like Ravenswood Manor where every bungalow is unique, and it all based on, did the family hire the architect? Did the developer hire the architect? How strict was the developer about making the architect do unique things? Did the family buy a stock bungalow plan? Who'd they buy the brick from? I mean, there's so many factors that lead them to look either really similar or really unique. And it's funny you bring up brick matching, because I work at a brick company. It's called Bricks Incorporated. We're a little village. But we actually have bungalow owners and historic homeowners from all over Chicago coming to us all the time being like, I need 50 bricks and they definitely don't make this anymore. So it's something we deal with a lot.
Yeah, and your stuff looks pretty amazing, actually. I was like shocked when you showed me some new brick that looked old. I was like,
yeah.
Yeah,
really... there's a lot of bricks, a whole fascinating separate topic, but
no, we have other questions too. Otherwise, I feel I worry you and I are going to go off on a brick like bender. So,
yeah, many different kinds.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I'm always just like, they're all different. They're not all the same, because they really got like little things, and that's an old trick. Like they were doing that, in Europe way before bungalows were being built. Okay, so how were the unfinished attics used? I have one in my home and wondered why they did that with all the space, and why not finish it. Again, if you want to take it, feel free. Otherwise,
it became a cost thing. So, and Carla mentioned this, as you get into the later 20s, people have a little bit more money. That's when they start putting in the art glass and, the finer features of the home. But a lot of the early bungalows, my great grandparents one being a great example, they were built not to be, they've always been middle-class housing, and it spanned the gambit from, lower middle class to upper middle class. But part of the thing that made them affordable was, not finishing out that loft, not finishing out that basement, but providing it as an option for that homeowner to customize it to their own liking, or, just to have that choice about whether or not they wanted to invest that additional money. And I found a really great thing while I was doing some more research on this, that, it was almost like a status to just like have an attic you didn't have to use. Because if you were throwing, your seventh kid upstairs, like, are you bungalow caliber?
Yeah, some of these, if you look at the old census data on these also, it cost them at the time, it was anywhere in the old permits rather. And the permits, they would cost anywhere from between about $4,500 to about, some of them were up to around $10,000. But on average, between 5,500 and 7,500 is like probably what I see most often, which is crazy. But because they mass produced it, they had the same workers. Yeah. And they would buy like every other lot on a street face too. And the developer was often also the architect, or the, like they were so smart about how they did all of that. And absolutely about not finishing those attics. That was a big part of why they were so affordable, and kind of brilliant, you know.
I think it's important to mention too that like when we say a lot of different architects got into it, like you think about Chicago today as a city that has so many architecture firms, but the reality is in the prior to 1930 in the Great Depression, which wiped out, I want to say like 50% of our architecture firms, there were countless just single dudes who'd be like, yeah, I'm an architect, I'll build you that. You know? And a lot of those little firms got wiped out in the Great Depression and never came back. So it was a lot of, you know, people who would do one house, two houses, and do it on the side, do it as a favor, do it for some hush money, whatever.
Yeah, and we get some weird, we have a lot of people writing into us at the association too, like, is my house a bungalow? Like today, Angela and I were grappling because we were like, it's like a cottagelow, like a bunga cottage, you know, like, because you'll find a lot of these variations too. Hang on, let me just look at a couple of these questions. How did the concrete projections on the front to hold flowers come about? And can you buy the planters to fit them anywhere? That's actually limestone, they're not concrete. Those little things that protrude, some people aren't quite sure. Most of those used to have stone planters on top of them that over the years broke, you know, whatever. You know, so most people have them rebuilt in wood now. And we've worked with some people in the past, and I know we were, I can't remember if we're currently working with anybody about that, but I know we used to work with someone who would sort of take motifs from the house and, you know, sort of put them on the planters and stuff. Also, many of you on the wing walls, on top of the limestone caps, the tops of the wing walls that of brick that go up the stairs on the other side of your stairs, there were often planters on the ends of those as well. So, which just over time were stolen or broken with freeze thaw cycles or whatever. But great question. A lot of people want to have those replaced, and I will check with Angela's going to send an email out, I should say, to everybody as well after this. Everybody who signed up. So you're going to get you know, a link to, you know, this recording, which again is also going to be on our website at chicagobungalow.org and on our Facebook page, but also. If there's, we might have that also on our website in terms of our references, our recommendations for contractors, but I'll ask Angela to put something in there about planters if we are currently working with somebody on that, because it's been a thing we've done on and off over the years because it's such an important thing. So let me see. Where do we find replacement bricks? They want the name, location, contact info, etc. So I'll let you take that, but before that, just really quick, in addition to having them manufactured, you can also look places like Craigslist or I used to work with the Evanston Rebuilding Warehouse. We used to get bricks in all the time because we had a deconstruction program. It's hard to find exact matches. It can be really tricky. So if it's Chicago Common brick, that's one thing. If it's like a raked brick where you have multiple colors sort of coming through, well, I'll let Patty take that. So.
The company I work for is a little small business, family-run business, been around since 1968. It's called Bricks Incorporated. Real hard name to remember. We're in Little Village at Kedzie and the I-55. We have a brickyard full of bricks from as far back as 1970, honestly. The most common, I'll just talk a little bit about brick matching because this is part of what I do all day at work. It's tricky because to some degree, it just depends on which brickyard you go to and what random old crap they have laying around. I say that with great affection, but so to some degree, you just will get lucky if you go to enough brickyards that you'll find someone with a really good match. The most important things that you need when you go looking for a brick match, measure your brick because they also come in many different sizes. They are often a standard brick, which is 8 inches. Today, most modern brick is 7 5/8 inches. So the dimensions differ. Make sure you measure your brick. Make sure you take photos in the shade and the sun, or bring us an actual brick, which is even better. And, you know, have a price in mind that you're willing to pay, because the sad thing is if you only need 50 brick because you're bricking in a window, you're kind of at the mercy of what is the closest match that that brickyard has. If you want a perfect exact match and you have a really, really unique brick with like a lot of range to it, iron spotting, so when it's kind of shiny, you know, always check your local brickyards first, but I think it can be a little tricky. We have people sometimes who the match that we find for them is just not close enough. But your next option is to order from like a big brick manufacturer. And there's some amazing brick manufacturers making handmade brick, making brick in every kind of way that they used to make it. But you know, a brick manufacturer wants to sell you 530 bricks, or what they call a cube. So if you're not willing to buy 530 bricks and pay for the freight for it to come in from Georgia or wherever, your options are a little bit more like what's immediately available. And that's where like Craigslist is handy. That's where, you know, visiting every brickyard is handy. Visiting old brickyards like ours, where we've just been collecting product for a long time. All those are good. But, you know, I say all that with the caveat of like, we're able to help most people really effectively, because we tend to buy in stock brick that a lot of people come and ask us for. You know, if you've got a red brick with a little bit of color range to it and it's got vertical scratching, you might be like, oh, this is such a crazy brick, but it's not. I mean, we got 30,000 of those if you want to buy some.
Got a guy. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But look us up, bricksync.net. Check out our website, email us, email me. I'm happy to talk about brick all day long. I love when historic homeowners are like, help me. If you're building an addition, it's easier because then you're buying 5,000, you know, it's easier. But if you got to redo your garage, easy, 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 easy.
Something is skipping with my sound right now. Weird.
Easy, easy.
Is that happening with your sound, Patty? Sorry.
Easy, 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 easy.
Okay, well, I'll keep going. Okay, somebody asked about their cantilevered style balcony, which needs to be rebuilt. For something like that, I think it's definitely going to be beyond the scope of what we could help with on this. But what we do have is at chicagobungalow.org, we have this trusted referrals page. And so I would click on that. So when you go on the main page, you'll see trusted referrals. Click on there and look for some contractors. They're gonna need to have somebody come out for sure for something like that. But now you know where to get brick if you need to have that redone. Oh wait, your sound, Patty, your sound is a little wonky, I think. Yeah, I can't hear you now, and I'm hearing yeah, okay. There was some sort of a repeat was going on there. So hang on, let me just see here really quick. With that. Yeah, I don't know. Something's on a loop with yours. So, well, we're pretty much wrapped up. The only remaining question was about Sears catalog homes contributing to the housing market in the 1930s. And I actually can't, I don't know about how they contributed specifically in the 1930s. I probably did at one point and forgot like the story around that, I'm afraid. But so I'm sorry I can't help you with that one specifically. Patty's having some technical issues. Yeah, no, it's still repeating, Patty. I don't know. Anyway, we're actually at time anyway. We are 3 minutes over. So so with that, I will just say thank you so much, Patty. This was so fascinating. I'm totally going to buy you a beer at Simon's as soon as things open up again, because I love that you also have a great affection for it. I really can't thank you enough. That was just so interesting. I learned also a lot more about immigrant history that I did not know. So thank you. We hope to see you again soon. Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. We had a huge number of folks come in and watch. So everybody have a lovely evening, have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you soon.